something has shifted in Eastern Europe. Not officially, not through declarations, not through diplomacy, but through pressure. Invisible pressure. The kind that builds silently until it becomes impossible to ignore. Because for years, Belarus was considered one of the most stable pillars of Russia's Western strategic depth. A buffer state, a staging ground, a logistical extension of Russian military planning. But today, that assumption is breaking. And at the center of this shift is one disturbing reality. Belarus is no longer operating in a low-pressure environment. It is now sitting directly under strategic visibility. And that changes everything. For Alexander Lukashenko, the political balance has always depended on one equation. Russia provides security and economic survival. Belarus provides territory and strategic depth. Ukraine, for years, remained the opposing front, but largely reactive. That balance is now gone, because Ukraine is no longer just reacting. It is mapping, it is tracking, and it is building what analysts describe as deep strike awareness across Belarusian territory. Not symbolic targets, not theoretical planning, but infrastructure-level intelligence mapping. Airbases, refineries, rail junctions, logistics hubs, military staging areas. And this is where the psychological shift begins. Because when a state begins to understand the full structure of another state's military logistics, it changes the behavior of every actor inside that system. Belarus, geographically, has always occupied a dangerous position. It sits between three pressure zones. To the south, Ukraine. To the west, NATO-aligned Poland, Lithuania, Latvia. To the east, Russia. This creates a strategic triangle where Belarus is not just a country. It is a corridor, a passage point, a logistics bridge. And in military planning, corridor states are always the most vulnerable during escalation cycles. Because they are not just defending borders. They are defending movement. Movement of troops, movement of fuel, movement of equipment, movement of supply chains. And when movement becomes contested, entire national systems begin to slow down. In the early phase of the Ukraine conflict, Belarus played a passive but critical role. It was used as a launch zone, a staging area, a support corridor for Russian operations in the north. And for a time, that role seemed stable. But stability in geopolitics is often temporary when one condition changes. Perceived vulnerability. And what has changed now is not Belarus geography. It is Ukraine's capability projection. Over time, Ukraine has developed deeper intelligence reach, long-range strike systems, drone-based reconnaissance networks, and layered targeting frameworks that extend beyond immediate front lines. What this creates is not just military capability. It creates awareness dominance, the ability to understand where pressure could be applied if escalation occurs. And that is where the strategic shift becomes important. Because once a state believes it is fully visible to another state, it behaves differently. It becomes cautious, reactive, constrained, even if no strike has occurred, even if no attack is launched. The perception of exposure is enough to change decision-making. Inside Belarus, this creates a silent contradiction. On one side, the government continues to maintain alignment with Russia. Economic dependency, security dependency, political alignment. But on the other side, there's growing awareness that Belarus is now part of a much larger strategic equation. One where infrastructure is no longer just infrastructure. It is potential targeting data. And logistics hubs are no longer just economic nodes. They are strategic vulnerabilities. And this is where the narrative tension begins to build. Because reports and analysis suggest that Ukraine's strategic mapping includes hundreds of potential targets across Belarusian territory. Airfields that support Russian operations, fuel storage facilities that sustain logistics chains, rail junctions that connect eastern supply lines, industrial nodes that can be repurposed for military support. Whether or not every detail is confirmed is not the core issue. The core issue is perception. Because in geopolitics, perception becomes operational reality. And Lukashenko is now operating inside a system where every decision carries dual pressure. Pressure from Moscow to maintain alignment. Pressure from regional instability, increasing exposure risk. And pressure from internal economic limitations that restrict flexibility. This is not a balanced position. It is a constrained one. And constrained systems rarely remain stable for long periods. To understand why this matters, you have to zoom out. Eastern Europe today is not a static environment. It is a layered escalation zone, where every actor is watching the other actor's capabilities more closely than their actual actions. NATO is watching Russian force distribution. Russia is watching NATO expansion signals. Ukraine is watching supply chain continuity. And Belarus is sitting in the middle of all three pressure systems. Without independent strategic depth, without strong external alliances beyond dependency structures, and without the ability to absorb large-scale escalation pressure without consequences. This is why Belarus has become a silent focal point. Because it is not the strongest actor. It is not the weakest actor. It is the most exposed connector. And in geopolitical systems, connectors are often the first to feel systemic stress. And now the environment is shifting again, because as the Ukraine conflict continues, the nature of warfare itself is changing. It is no longer just territorial. It is informational. It is infrastructural. It is targeting-based, meaning that visibility equals vulnerability. And once a system becomes fully visible, it stops being strategically opaque. It becomes predictable. And predictability is the first step toward control pressure. Belarus now exists in that space. A space where its military geography is fully understood. Its infrastructure layers are mapped. Its logistical dependencies are analyzed. And its strategic value is defined not by what it chooses to do, but by what others believe it can do. And that is where the most dangerous geopolitical transitions begin. Not with war, not with invasion, but with mapping, with visibility, with awareness of weakness points. Because once a state is fully mapped in strategic terms, it becomes part of every future planning scenario. Even if no action is taken immediately, even if nothing changes on the surface, the system underneath is already different. And in Belarus, that system is now under increasing tension. Not visible tension, not declared tension, but structural tension. The kind that builds inside logistical networks, military assumptions, and political decision frameworks. The kind that does not explode immediately, but accumulates over time until decisions begin to shift. And this is where the situation begins to escalate toward its next phase. Because once a state becomes aware that it is fully integrated into another country's strategic targeting logic, it begins to reassess its own risk environment. Even if it cannot openly acknowledge it, even if it must maintain public alignment, even if no external action forces it, the internal calculation changes. And that change is where the next stage begins. The situation inside Belarus is no longer just a geopolitical observation. It is becoming a pressure system, a system where every external factor is compressing internal decision space. And when decision space shrinks, states begin to behave differently. Not dramatically, but structurally. Because at this stage, Belarus is not operating in a vacuum. It is operating inside overlapping strategic layers. One layer is military alignment with Russia. Another layer is economic dependence on Russian energy, trade, and financial systems. And a third layer is the rising awareness of Ukrainian intelligence reach across the broader region. Each layer pulls in a different direction. And when systems are pulled in multiple directions at once, they do not remain stable for long periods. They begin to adjust, slowly, carefully, and often inconsistently. This is why Lukashenko's position appears increasingly unstable in strategic analysis. Not because of a single event, but because of accumulated pressure, asymmetry. He is no longer operating as a fully autonomous decision-maker. He is operating as a balancing node between two larger systems. Russia on one side, Ukraine and NATO-aligned pressure structures on the other. And neither system is static. Both are evolving. Both are escalating in different ways. And this is where intelligence becomes the most important factor in the entire equation. Because modern conflict is no longer defined only by battlefield engagement. It is defined by visibility. Who can see what? Who can map what? Who can anticipate what? And most importantly, who believes they are being observed? Ukraine's intelligence and strike capabilities have evolved significantly over the course of the conflict, not just in physical range, but in structural awareness. The ability to identify patterns in infrastructure networks, the ability to map logistics dependencies, the ability to understand which nodes in a system carry strategic weight. Airfields are no longer just airfields. They're staging points. Fuel depots are no longer just storage. They're sustainment nodes. Rail lines are no longer just transport routes. They're operational arteries. And once a system is understood in this way, it becomes vulnerable in a different sense, not through immediate destruction, but through conditional exposure. This is what creates the psychological shift inside Belarus. Because even without direct escalation, the knowledge that strategic infrastructure is visible changes behavior. It forces redistribution of resources. It forces defensive reorganization. It forces political caution. And it forces constant reassessment of risk thresholds. And meanwhile, Russia continues to rely on Belarus as a strategic extension of its Western operational depth. Historically, Belarus has provided staging access toward Ukraine's northern regions, logistical corridors for military movement, strategic buffer space between NATO and Russian territory. But buffers only work when they are stable, and stability is no longer guaranteed. Because the Ukraine conflict has transformed the entire regional security architecture. What used to be a relatively predictable three-layer system, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, has now become a multi-layered escalation environment involving NATO surveillance systems, long-range strike capabilities, distributed intelligence networks, and continuous infrastructure monitoring. This is not a traditional battlefield anymore. It is a continuous strategic observation zone. And in such an environment, Belarus becomes extremely sensitive to escalation perception. Even rumors of targeting capability change political behavior. Even hypothetical scenarios influence strategic posture. Even analytical reports reshape military planning assumptions. Because in modern hybrid conflict environments, perception often becomes a form of pressure itself. Now imagine the internal position of Belarusian leadership. On one side, Russia expects continued alignment, logistical support, and strategic cooperation. On the other side, Ukraine's expanding operational reach introduces uncertainty into previously assumed safe zones. And internally, Belarus must maintain economic stability in a system that is heavily dependent on external support. This creates a triangle of constraints, not a triangle of opportunities, a triangle of limitation. And limitation is where strategic inflection begins. Because when all available paths carry risk, decision-making becomes conservative. When decision-making becomes conservative, initiative declines. And when initiative declines, external forces begin to define the environment. This is where the concept of trap state becomes relevant, not in the sense of physical entrapment, but in the sense of strategic enclosure. A situation where every available option carries consequences that limit future flexibility. Alignment with Russia increases dependency risk. Neutrality risks political instability. Alignment with Western structures risks immediate escalation. There is no frictionless path, only weighted decisions. And over time, weighted decisions accumulate. They reshape policy. They reshape military posture. They reshape diplomatic behavior. And eventually, they reshape strategic identity. Now consider the geographical reality. Belarus is not a large maritime power. It does not have deep ocean access. It does not have strategic naval projection. It does not have independent energy dominance. Its strategic identity is defined by its position between larger powers, which means its value is relational, not autonomous. And relational value is always sensitive to external pressure changes. This is why Ukraine's increasing intelligence reach matters so significantly. Not because it guarantees action, but because it alters the perceived cost structure of regional decisions. And in geopolitics, perceived cost is often more influential than actual cost. At the same time, Russia's broader strategic focus remains concentrated on its Western military engagement. This creates a secondary effect. Regions outside the immediate conflict zone receive less strategic attention, less reinforcement, less adaptive planning, and less infrastructural investment relative to wartime priorities. This is how secondary pressure zones emerge in long conflicts, not through direct confrontation, but through resource reallocation. And once resources are reallocated, peripheral systems begin to adjust independently. In Belarus's case, this adjustment is subtle but continuous. It appears in defense planning adjustments, in logistical recalibration, in increased sensitivity to border activity, and in more cautious political signaling. Not public collapse, not dramatic change, but directional movement. And directional movement is what geopolitical analysts watch most closely, because direction determines trajectory, and trajectory determines long-term outcomes. Now stepping back, the broader Eastern European system is entering a phase where every actor is operating under constrained strategic flexibility. Russia is constrained by external conflict commitments. Ukraine is constrained by resource limitations and ongoing war pressure. NATO is constrained by escalation management considerations. And Belarus is constrained by its position between all three systems. This creates a region defined not by stability, but by managed tension, a system where equilibrium is constantly adjusted but never fully resolved. And in such systems, small changes can have disproportionate effects. A new intelligence capability, a new logistical route, a new surveillance pattern, a new military deployment assumption. Each one shifts the balance slightly, but cumulatively, they reshape the entire strategic environment. And this is why the situation surrounding Belarus is not just a regional issue. It is a structural indicator of how modern hybrid conflict environments evolve, not through decisive battles, but through continuous pressure layering. And as pressure layers accumulate, states begin to behave differently than their historical patterns suggest. They become more cautious, more reactive, more constrained, and more sensitive to external signals. And that is where this situation ultimately leads. Not to immediate collapse, not to direct confrontation, but to a long-term strategic redefinition of what Belarus represents in the Eastern European security architecture.